Okay, yes, it's nice and interactive. I enjoy it. So first of all, I would like to say a really big thank you to Daniel and to Filter Max for the opportunity to speak. We've been collaborating for some years now, and whilst I've been at other companies and looking at the agenda that you as the audience have been enjoying, there's a couple of the companies that I've worked at, so I hope that they were enjoyable presentations. So to introduce myself and my background, my name is Darren Gale, and I'm running BigID outside of Americas, essentially everything from Iceland to New Zealand, and I've been with the company for 6 months now. Prior to that, I was working at a company called Vectra, which I understand you've had a presentation from Daniel upon earlier today. And prior to that, I was working at FireEye, running the Mandiant's business there. And so you've also had a presentation from FireEye. So very, very familiar with the content. And I hope to educate you about BigID if you haven't yet heard about BigID. And so thank you very much for the opportunity to present, Daniel. It's fantastic. And today I'm going to talk about data governance for privacy and security. And essentially the convergence of the three disciplines of governance, privacy and security, and how all three disciplines revolve around data. And then I'm going to show you how BigID provides a horizontal value across those three disciplines. And I'm even going to give you a brief demonstration, which you'll be delighted to know is my very first presentation in a public forum. So a demonstration in a public forum. So don't be too tough on me. So, so here we go. So as I mentioned, we have three different disciplines here. So you have data privacy, data security, and data governance. And of course, all three are revolving around data as the core. And there have been very, very interesting changes and evolution in these three disciplines over the course of the last few years. Now, you've had a lot of information in the course of this session so far yesterday and today around data security. And of course, data security is very, very important and an ever evolving landscape. And essentially, there's lots of different strategies to employ to increase your security posture and reduce your risk associated with information security. And but of course, one of the key targets of the threat actors is your data set, and whether that is your data related to your employees, your customers, or your intellectual property. There is a consideration in that mix around the data related to customers and employees and the privacy of that data, and how the data in fact belongs to the subject, and as an organization you are only a custodian of that data whilst you're consuming it. And this leads into the data governance frameworks and the requirements for organizations to maximize the value from their data assets. And I'm going to talk about where these three things intersect and give you some nice examples, I hope. So let's take a brief history of data. And this is quite an enjoyable picture you see on here. This is the first of the computing rooms, the mainframe architecture here. I'm sure there are many people on the call who can remember these sorts of scenarios. One data pipe into the environment and one data pipe out of the environment. And in many cases, the environments were entirely isolated. And so the data in this context was very secure, if you like, because it was in a enclosed ecosystem, and very easily monitored, and control and access was very strict and structured. Then we moved to open systems in the kind of post-mainframe era. And it's just a little enjoyable picture here. I've seen many data centers that look in far worse state than this one, even though this is quite colorful. Essentially, the opportunity to increase computing power, agility, versatility, based upon consuming industry standard servers, industry standard operating systems, opening the systems up and being able to take advantage of the huge flexibility that that afforded. It came though with some challenges, and of course the challenges were that as you distributed your workloads across these different systems, your requirement to secure that data set became ever more challenging, and you ended up with a situation where you had a strategy typically which was a defense at the logical perimeter. This gave rise to some of the strength of the organizations selling firewalls and filtering type technologies, of course, but essentially lots of business benefits, but also introducing lots of management challenges, shall we say. And then, kind of where are we today? Well, where indeed. So there is a rapid movement to the cloud, certainly for non-critical systems, and increasingly for critical systems. Essentially, there are lots of different options if you want to adopt a cloud computing strategy. Hybrid mode related to the cloud, but essentially, of course, the challenge there is that your perimeter is ultimately diffuse, and so your perimeter effectively becomes the data, right, rather than a logical perimeter, physical perimeter, a boundary upon which you can draw build a wall. So essentially, you're in a position where all of the benefits that come with the modern computing architecture related to agility, speed, cost, of course, again, further take us away from that mainframe era, but increase the complexity for management overhead. And in particular, from the data perspective, the privacy perspective, and the security perspective. So what we're seeing, and this is a couple of comments here from one from Gartner and one from Forrester, related to what Gartner calls zero trust, and Forrester is calling data-centric security. But it is the idea that as your logical perimeter becomes more and more diffuse, you end up in a situation where you need to retreat your boundary to the data. How do you do that? Well, you retreat your boundary to the data by focusing much more on the access control and assuming that all systems potentially in your infrastructure may be compromised, and therefore focusing on the user consuming the data and their credentials, and employing strategies like two-factor authentication and so on. But it is certainly a time of great change, and the traditional security models, which were once fantastic for those legacy computing architectures, are increasingly becoming in need of updating. So let's talk about where your data is in the modern computing architecture. So top left here on this slide, you've got a database cluster in a nice tidy rack environment. Someone is an artisan when it comes to the cabling, I can see there. And essentially, this is, where your data is. It's in this rack. Okay, you know, this is an on-premise database cluster. You know exactly where the data is. You know exactly what you need to protect. But let's take a look at these other three environments here, and these are actually pictures of an Amazon data center, an Azure data center, and a Google Cloud data center. And of course, the challenge is, where is your data sitting in those data centers? It's in there somewhere. In the Amazon one, you know, it might be on one of those in one of those racks. It might be in some of the disks that are spinning in there, or the solid state environments. Likewise in the Azure one. But the Google one is somewhat perplexing in that you'll notice that you can't actually even see any computing infrastructure. So so you know, where is your data indeed? So so it does present a challenge. And certainly, in order to provide the robust security measures that are required in the modern environment, in order to maintain a position of complying to regulatory pressure, but also philosophically ensuring that your business is secure, then how do you do that in this landscape where the visibility of where your data is much more challenging? So so we've talked a little bit about security there in terms of securing the modern infrastructure. So let's progress on to one of these other topics, okay, and talk about data governance. Now this slide is very interesting for me. Oh, let me hide the control panel just in case that's blocking your view. Apologies. So this slide is very interesting for me because this is looking at the world's most valuable companies. And if you look at today versus 25 years ago, there is a very significant difference in the most valuable companies in the world. So 25 years ago, you can see that it was car manufacturers, it was oil and gas companies, it was food and beverage, and companies, healthcare companies, and intellectual property companies. Yeah. But today, the landscape is radically different. Okay, so today the landscape is that primarily the most valuable companies are dominated by data organizations. And whether you're looking at Amazon or you're looking at Facebook or Microsoft or Apple, primarily they are data organizations. What does this really tell us? Well, I think it tells us that there is no question that data is your most valuable asset. Okay, and those organizations that take advantage of their data and fully leverage the value included within that data have a massive competitive advantage. And so this has spawned an entire discipline within enterprise organizations around how to govern data in order to make sure that the data is accurate and there's an appropriate data quality. But also then how do you consume that data in order to optimize business value and optimize business productivity. And next slide. And so if you look at data governance, you can Google data governance, data management, and so on, and you get these sorts of images being returned. And in the discipline, there are lots and lots of different variations upon this. But essentially, the requirement as detailed here is fundamentally that you need to know your data. You need to know your data, you need to have a registry of that data, you need to understand where there are anomalies in that data and there is poor data quality. You need to understand how the data is flowing through your organization. You need to expose that data to new services that allow you to innovate, and that can drive decisions around architecture. And most of all, you need to ensure that the data is being accessed appropriately, and that it's being accessed by, it's readily available for the systems or mathematical models or people who need to consume that data. But of course, it's not accessible to those people who are not allowed to consume that data, and whether that is other people in the organization or indeed people outside the organization. So the key thing is in terms of data governance, that it's spawned new job roles, and these new job roles have made their ways into organizations and become increasingly frequently seen. So you have the data quality manager, whose responsibility, of course, is to identify where there is a decline in data quality, inconsistencies, what the root cause of those inconsistencies are, and so on. There are the data architects, and historically, you know, there's been infrastructure architects, but now we have data architects planning how the data within the organization can be optimized and best utilized in new business processes. You have the data scientists who are writing mathematical models that consume the data and derive new insights into business opportunities. You have the analysts, you have the data stewards, and the data stewards are the individuals who have responsibility for the stewardship of the data within the organization. And of course, that is to ensure that as a custodian of that data, the data is used appropriately and in compliance with the regulatory frameworks. And ultimately, these job roles are rolling up into senior leadership. Historically, that's often been the operational officer, the chief operational officer, the COO. But more recently, we've seen the emergence of a new job role, which is the chief data officer. And the CDO is certainly someone who is increasing in terms of power and gravitas in many organizations, and is increasingly a senior and operational role. So we've talked a little bit about data security and whether the importance of focusing on the data. We've talked about data governance and the value that that can bring. So let's talk a little bit about data privacy. So data privacy is a very hot topic, as I'm sure you'll appreciate. We in Europe introduced the GDPR regulation. What was that, 2 years ago now? And GDPR was a significant transition in terms of harmonizing the privacy regulations that were existing in each individual member state. But what was really fascinating with GDPR and subsequent regulations that have been introduced in other geographies outside of Europe, like the Californian Consumer Privacy Act, POPIA in South Africa, KVKK in Turkey, and the list goes on and on and on. But there has been a transition away from PII to PI. And you can draw a comparison here on this slide. So PII historically was just really related to the most sensitive data. But in fact, under the privacy regulations, anything that can be attributed to an individual becomes subject of that regulation. And so PI, where you can see all of these additional fields, come into play. And it presents, again, significant challenges for organizations because the focus historically may have been on, for example, payment card information, because that's been more heavily regulated for a longer time. And so the strategies employed to provide a robust approach to protecting, securing and managing payment card information may not be the same as is available for PI information. And yet the reality is that the regulatory pressure is indicating that this broader data set needs the same degree of protection. And so we've seen a great deal of investment and a great deal of interest in how organizations can address the requirements for understanding where in their environments they have sensitive data that is beyond things like credit card numbers, but also including things like IP addresses that can be attributed to an individual. And making sure that that data is appropriately dealt with in the organization and can be called upon as required under the regulation in order to service specific aspects of the regulation. And so in particular, there's a couple of things that most organizations are focused upon. The first one is called a subject access request, which is where an individual can consume can make a request to know what data is being held about them in any organization. And making that request, the clock begins and the organization has 30 days in which to respond, showing all of the data that is held upon that subject. Now, for smaller, less complex organizations, perhaps using one central customer relationship system, the burden of that particular piece of regulation may not be too great. But for larger, more complex or distributed organizations, the burden of that regulation is significant. So if I take an example where I have a relationship with a telecommunications provider for my mobile phone service, I have an app on my phone. I've visited them in the shopping mall, in their store. I've visited them at a trade show. I've been on their website. I have an account on the website. And all of these different touch points for me mean that ultimately in that telco, there are probably hundreds of data attributes associated to me, whether that is related to the billing system, the marketing system, the customer relationship system, the complaints system, or whatever, in their ticketing system. But there are hundreds of attributes, and they're probably held across 20, 30, 50, even more different systems. So when I submit a subject access request to that organization, it really does create a very challenging environment for which they have 30 days to find all that data and then return all that data in a compelling format to me as the subject, because I own that data. It's my data, and they are simply a custodian of it. Additionally, there is a burden under the regulation which is related to something called the record of processing activity. And the record of processing activity is where you are required to demonstrate a full working knowledge of any data that you have collected and how that data flows around your organization, how it is processed, how you share it with third parties, and the steps you've taken to ensure that that data is appropriately controlled. Mapping onto that, you also have consent. And are you keeping any data for which you don't have consent? And it's really, really fascinating and complex and challenging. And so most organizations, and this is a generalization, but most organizations will standardize their strategy around data to the lowest common denominator, which is required under the GDPR regulation. And so I'll give you a funny analogy. Imagine you find a bunch of keys, okay, in your neighborhood, and you throw those keys into a bucket, and then you find some more keys and you throw them into the bucket, and then later you find some more keys and you throw them into the bucket, and then at some point you decide you want to take advantage and look at those keys in the bucket. But in the bucket you've got house keys, car keys, shed keys, keys for your bicycle lock, and so because there are house keys in there, and the possibility that there are house keys in there, and there are rules that say that you cannot use the house keys, therefore you cannot use any of the keys, right? And this is the challenge. The analogy for data is exactly the same. So how can you take advantage of data that you're allowed to use, but it's mixed up in your environment with data that you're not necessarily allowed to use because you don't have the consent? and it does create a very, very significant challenge, but one we can help with. So here's the regulatory framework, and every single day there's a new regulation which is emerging. And the really good news is that BigID is able to help service any of these regulations. So if you are a multinational or an international company and servicing customers in these other geographies, there is a regulatory pressure beyond GDPR that you have to consider, and understanding what that might be and how that impacts you is something that is well worth understanding. So I think we all agree that you have an intersection between data governance, data security, and data privacy, and ultimately the intersection is data. But I've replaced the word data in this slide with BigID, and BigID is the company that I'm representing. And essentially, we have some technology which can assist across all three of these disciplines in helping you to achieve the goals as detailed in this presentation. So if you'll indulge me, I'll give you a brief introduction now to BigID, and then I'll show you a little bit of what the technology is able to do. So essentially, BigID is at its foundation a discovery platform, and originally it was designed for GDPR, and for that use case, that telecommunications use case I gave you of the subject access request, and the idea that you would need to look into many different systems and be able to find all the data related to me, Darren Gale, as the subject. And so we built the platform based upon a philosophy of supporting the maximum number of data sources that we would experience in our customer base. And so we support all different types of unstructured data source. So different types of file shares, for example, whether they're in the cloud, whether they're on premise, legacy file shares, and so on. Structured data sources like Oracle or SAP for HANA or SQL servers and so on. So we also support semi-structured data sources like some of the object relational databases in the modern database architecture like MongoDB, for example. We support big data environments, Hadoop and Hive and so on. And you can see the list here at the very bottom of this slide in terms of the foundation of what we're doing is we're able to connect to a very wide range of data sources, including messaging, including data in motion through data pipelines like Kafka and Kinesis, including SaaS services where you're consuming SaaS applications, where your data is being held, but also infrastructure as a service. And we have very, very good coverage in the cloud environments for the Google stack, the Azure stack, and for the AWS stack. And we continue to innovate and add additional connectors on a 2-week basis based upon our release schedule. And so we're very proud to be able to say that we have the widest coverage of data sources in the market. But we're always recognizing there's more to add, right? So we continue to do that. So having connected to these data sources, we're able then to drive a discovery activity. And the discovery activity is driven by these colorful elements on this slide here. So a lot of data discovery tools that have existed historically have used this classification strategy, which is regular expression pattern matching. And BigID does some of that as well, and we find some useful use cases. There are some challenges with classification, which I'm sure any of you who have deployed DLP tools or other discovery tools will have experience of, which is that there is a terrible false positive and false negative rate. And so what we've done at BigID is we've looked at what classifiers that can add value for us, and then we've gone further and created some very advanced techniques for classification. And so we have a technique, for example, called named entity recognition, which allows us to do regular expression pattern matching, but on fields which historically you would never have been able to match accurately. And so we get some really fantastic results, and classification is an important part of the value that we bring. Further to that, we have something called cluster analysis. And this is where we look for data that is similar. And so you can think of it as a kind of fuzzy classification, if you like. And so we look for everything that looks like a CV, or everything that looks like a blueprint, or everything that looks like a boarding pass, depending on what your interest is. And this is extremely important in terms of identifying sensitive documentation. So show me all the passports that have been held, all the CVs and so on. But it's also really important in terms of security strategy. So if you want to move data to the cloud and you want to classify that data in terms of labeling as sensitive or as a secret or so on, then we can do that in a kind of bulk fashion based upon cluster analysis and grouping similar data together. And then on the right hand side of this slide, you have the correlation element. And correlation is really the ultimate secret sauce of BigID. And what correlation does is correlation allows us to look at the data attributes and to reconcile those data attributes back to what we call an entity. And that entity, in most cases, is an employee or a customer, but it could also be an insurance policy, a SKU, stock keeping unit, a blueprint or a patent. So it's something unique in the environment that you can train BigID to learn about, and then map the data fragments that are found, the different attributes in all the different systems, back to that individual, and I'm sure, or back to that entity. And I'm sure that you will appreciate the power of that when it comes to fulfilling things like subject access request, because essentially what we do is create a virtual master data record of all of the data attributes in the environment related to that entity. And so for me, if my telco had BigID deployed, then they would be able to just say, okay, show me all the data that is held on Darren. And essentially what we do is we do that without migrating any data. And this is also very, very important. So what we are doing is building an index to where all that data resides. So the BigID environment does not become another data lake or another repository of that data. So it's really elegant from that perspective. And then essentially the last of the 4 C's that you see on this Discovery Foundation is the catalog. And this is where we then expose all of this information that we have been able to discover and relate to the entities, and we expose that within the catalog for the business users to be able to consume. Incredibly compelling capability in terms of this requirement to know your data. And so the use cases are positioned in terms of these different kind of application stacks that sit on top of BigID. And what you'll notice in the very bottom right-hand corner of this slide is that there is this very open framework that we have, where not only is BigID creating applications to consume this discovered data, but also third parties are generating applications. And there is the opportunity, if you have a very unique requirement, that you could also write to this environment to call the data that you desire. Which is a very, very nice open architecture. So the three primary use cases that we're servicing here are privacy, security, and data governance. And our chief executive likes, 4 C's and 3 P's. So we call these privacy, protection, and perspective. But it's fundamentally privacy, information security use cases, and data governance use cases. And so in the privacy space, we've talked a little bit about the requirements there. You need to be able to show a record of processing activity. You need to be able to fulfill upon data subject access requests. You need to be able to see an inventory of your PI or PII data. We also have the ability to be able to map consent that you have gathered to the individual for their data, so that you can see if you have conflicting consent through different channels, if you are an omni-channel organization. And then most recently, we've introduced this ability for users, your customer base, potentially, to be able to manage a self-service requirement, to be able to say, okay, I want to see the data that you hold on me. I want to make a request. I want to change my consent levels with you as an organization. And we have a very nice workflow orchestration capability in what we call our DSAR port. Then in the security use cases, this central tier here, we have some very nice capability. So the primary use case is, of course, the visibility of the data, understanding where the data is, and exposing a data risk profile for you to be able to make decisions about where you need to make your security investments. So we can expose where you have data with open access, we can expose where you have data which is being inappropriately accessed, and so on. But you then have the ability to label the data with tags that are either hard tags, if you're using things like, for example, the Microsoft Azure Information Protection Framework, or soft tags, which you can then expose to other security tools. And the types of scenarios that play out there are, for example, if you want to do data minimization, or if you want to do data deduplication, if you want to do data obfuscation, tokenization, encryption, and so on, we can feed those tools with the labels appropriate to allow those tools then to drive their activity. So it really does deliver fantastic value in the security landscape. But one of my personal favorites, having come originally from the Mandiant business, is the value that we can bring in breach notification. And this also spills over into the privacy space, of course, based upon the regulation. And you will know that GDPR demands that you notify your data protection authority within 72 hours of discovering a data breach. And this poses significant challenges, because in those 72 hours, how do you determine the full extent of the data that has been exposed and the impact on your customer base or your employee base? And so one of the things that BigID does very elegantly is that if you have a sample of data that has been exposed, let's say you discover your data on Pastebin, or a threat actor is holding you to ransom and says, look, in order for you to pay ransom, I'll share with you a sample of the data. With BigID, you can sample that data, look at the data attributes and the data structure, and we can point you at the specific systems that would have been the origin of that data and are most likely the systems that are breached. So when you notify to your DPA, the Data Protection Authority, you don't have to say, oh, look, all 3 million of my customers might be impacted, because there are significant impacts in terms of your brand and in terms of the regulatory fines you might recognize if you take that approach. Instead, going and saying, yes, we've had a breach, but we know it's only these 10,000 customers from our customer base that may be impacted. Oh, and by the way, we've already let them know. Then there is a completely different landscape in terms of your dialogue with the Data Protection Authority. And so we deliver really, really nice value there. And then in the data governance space, we have these different capabilities built upon the catalog. So we have the ability to show where the data is within the environment, where data is being duplicated, the inferred transition of data from one source to another to support your data lineage activity. We have some advanced profiling capability where you can make sure, for example, if you're writing mathematical models and you have data scientists consuming that data, that the data that is feeding into that model is an indicative data sample of your customer base. Because, just a stupid example, but if you feed a mathematical model with data that is only white middle-aged men, then guess what? The answer is always going to be a white middle-aged man. The advanced profiling capability that we have to support the data science strategies and business intelligence strategies is extremely valuable. And then we have value to deliver around identifying anomalies in data quality. So let's say you have a database table and the database table has an email column and that has no emails in it, but all the emails are being held within the field comments, then that's something that's really important to the business in terms of how you then feed that, consume that data in other applications. And then we can also automatically populate the third-party data catalogs if you're an SAP customer or an Informatica customer or a customer of Calibra or Elation, and you have a third-party data catalog. We can feed business, operational, and technical metadata into that catalog if you have a third-party catalog. So we play a really important role in the cataloging process, as well as servicing the security use cases, as well as servicing the privacy use cases. And so that is a whirlwind introduction to BigID. And at this point, I thought that it would be appropriate for us to, oh, sorry, there's one summary slide, look at that. Sorry, I was going to pivot to demo. So one summary slide, which is, so BigID in the center of these three disciplines that we've been talking about, where there is a requirement to know your data and to service specific use cases related to data governance, security, and privacy. And BigID sits at the nexus, the intersection of those three disciplines, as demonstrated in this particular slide. And so if you have appetite from a security perspective to have some assistance there, or from a privacy perspective, then I strongly recommend that in those projects, you engage with the data governance team or the security team or the privacy team as well. And then what you will see is that you can share the cost in order to service your requirements. And it's always satisfying for a privacy project if security can help pay for it, or if you can get the data governance guys to help pay for it, or in security if you can get the data guys to pay for some of your security capability. So it's really valuable to bring those other stakeholders into a conversation and have this cross-functional approach to how you deal with your data. And we can be a supporting variable in that mix, giving value across all three disciplines. So now we're going to pivot to the demo. So let me, hopefully I have not timed out. So this, everybody, is the BigID dashboard, okay? And essentially this is a statistical dashboard in this demonstration environment. But the first thing that I will highlight to you is that we have in this environment 22 data sources that are configured. So BigID is interrogating 22 data sources. These could be databases, these could be file systems, these could be cloud repositories, any mix of those. In fact, I can show you the data sources that are configured here. But you will notice immediately that we have 13 sources with PI records in there. Okay, so that's the first thing. Driven the discovery, we can show you where some of the sensitive data is held. Now, interestingly, you can see that we've actually discovered 1.3 million personal data records across these 13 data sources. Yeah, and so this is again giving you a view of the scale of the data set which is available within the environment. Now, interestingly, again, you will see over here that in terms of entities, those 1.3 million data records actually relate to 158,000 entities, and most likely this is people. Okay, so you've got 158,000 entities, all with a total of 1.3 million data attributes. And actually, you can see that there are 79 different data attributes which are held across these different entities. So of course, not all entities have all 79, but there are up to 79 here. So additionally, here you can see that we have a graphical representation of the data within the environment, and so you can see where the data is resident, where the data sources are, and where the applications are that are consuming the data. And so you can begin to map the data flow within the organization. So the residencies relate to the residencies of the data subjects. The sources are, of course, where these data sources are located. So is this the AWS instance in Frankfurt? Is this the database that's in Budapest? Is this the SaaS application that's hosted in California, right? And so on. So and so then you can begin to see how this data is flowing around your organization. We also here have a widget which is exposing a risk profile. Okay, and the risk profile is calculated based upon a number of different variables that you configure in order to show you where you have data that is on open shares or being accessed by a large number of people, even though there's sensitive data there, and so on. And you can define the policies which contribute to the risk profile. And then you've got, in terms of data source coverage here, you can see some of the different data sets here. And then you've got here just a dashboard widget showing policy compliance. And the policy compliance relates to policies that you define, and they can be related to data residency, they can be related to regulatory frameworks and so on, and we include a whole bunch of policies out of the box that you can then edit. But one might be, for example, show me any Romanian customer data that's held outside Romania, because I'm sure you're familiar that Romania has a sovereign data boundary, unlike a lot of the other countries in the EU. And so that might be a policy that you're doing some work across the border in Romania, and you want to make sure that the data for your Romanian clients stays in Romania because of that data sovereignty requirement. So here we also have, on the left-hand side, visibility of the different foundational layers of the discovery. So we talked about classification, and in classification, we have the ability to be able to see the different classifiers here that we've been using. So for example here, named entity recognition, this is an example of one of those advanced classifiers that we talked about, trying to do pattern matching against full name or against phone numbers. You can see here NER, named entity recognition. But you can see the classifiers that are listed here, and there's a whole bunch of them, and you can choose which ones you activate and don't activate. And again, you then filter here based upon the different data sources where you're getting hits against those classifiers and against the different applications. And then in fact you can see more of the details here. In terms of cluster analysis, this is something which I think is very compelling in security. When you want to start to drive labeling and classification tiers based upon sensitivity. And so let's just drive a quick filter here on PI. So if we select the data sources that contain PI, you can see these are different forms. So here we've got a whole bunch of curriculum vitae, yeah, CVs, or declaration forms, or insurance cases. And then essentially you can segment your data based upon these groups and be able then to apply levels of sensitivity to them based upon different labeling and tagging strategies. One being, for example, Microsoft's information protection framework. And then here we have the correlation, and the correlation is very, very advanced capability. And what you have is the ability to be able to train the data set based upon a very few number of unique variables. And then the engine will find data that is in proximity. So if we look at email here, for example, you can see that there are two different systems here that contain email, but the naming convention of the fields in those systems are in fact different. But we know, because we've inspected the actual data, that this email attribute is applicable to both of them. And so if we take a look in medical in here, for example, you can see this is the actual data structure within the medical data set, and you can see that in this example it's email addresses where the emails are being held. If we actually look here, you can also see that the emails are being written to the content field in this data set. And here we provide, based upon the data quality, a view of the percentage of those fields which are populated. And so you're in a really fantastic position to be able to start to learn where there is an opportunity to be able to take advantage of the differences between your systems, and then build out a broader view of the data. And so again, you can see here that whilst we may have been looking for email, we've also found these additional fields, and then the engine has further discovered that this transaction number here is related to trans number in this financial data set. And then here you have bank number, and this is actually related to bank no in this data set. And so again, you can build out a really strong foundation in terms of understanding where data is held within your environment, and this provides the foundation for our ability to then be able to service the different use cases up on top. And so if we go and have a look at these use cases, here is the application framework. And so you've got here, so there's Microsoft Information Protection, you've got breach response in access intelligence, the risk configuration, and so on. You've got integrations here. This is to SAP's Data Hub. You can see that we have utilities where we can connect to third-party data repositories for credentials. And so on, and support for Calibra, support for Elastic, and so on here. But if we take a look as one example of access, what did I do there? Here we go. So access request management. So this is triggering a DSAR, so a data subject access request. And we can look for an individual here, and we can request the DSAR. So you can do it very, very simply by saying, okay, so let's see what we've got for Benjamin Terry, and it's showing there. It's gone off now because we have the index of where all the data relates to all of the individuals within the environment. It's now gone to interrogate those environments and pull back the results. So in terms of, if we take a look at some of the completed requests here, so you've got this Benjamin Terry example, and what you can do is you can either download the results, or you can take a look at the summary report. And so this is very interesting because you have the summary report for all of the attributes that we hold upon Benjamin Terry Young based upon the request. Okay, and you can see here we highlight if there is no purpose of keeping this data, yeah, or if there is an anomaly in terms of consent. So we highlight that. But here in the extended info, this is additional information that we've been able to infer that we have on file based upon those advanced discovery techniques of looking for data in proximity. And so you can see there are other PI related pieces of information that are held here. And then essentially you can download the report and you can share that report with the individual based upon the click of a button as a subject access request. Now, you may choose to have a different interface driving that request. So let's say you've got a service desk, or you've invested in a privacy management workflow like a TrustArc or a OneTrust or something like that. Then where the request is made there, the integration just flows through to our open environment, and this would all happen automatically. But it's incredibly compelling in terms of being able to draw all of the data back across all of those different systems in an incredibly timely manner, fully automated, delivering against that type of request. So, you know, this is just a very brief introductory tour to the kind of power of what we can deliver. Hopefully it's been interesting and informative, and you understand the value of knowing your data in the context of privacy use cases, security use cases, and data governance use cases. Incidentally, I don't think I showed you the catalog. I should have probably have done that. But essentially, here is the data catalog, which essentially shows all of the metadata attributes within the environment and where they're located across the environment. And so it gives you incredible insight into the available data that can be consumed by your business intelligence team or by your data scientists and so on. So a really, really powerful tool in terms of giving you the visibility that you may not have had owing to the natural way in which organizations evolve over time, with the addition of lots of incremental systems and complexity that comes with that. So hopefully that's been a useful session. Once again, thank you very much, Daniel, for the opportunity to present.